Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we'll be talking about audience analysis, Chapter 5 from the Public Speaking Project. I'm going to go ahead here and share my screen, and we'll go through our slides. Chapter 5 is all about getting to know who it is that you're speaking with, right? And so as we go into it, we'll speak about 5 different parts of this chapter. The first starting with the introduction, then we'll talk about direct observation, then analysis by inference, data sampling, and then finally, we'll speak about detailed analysis. Let's hop into it. First thing we talk about here when we talk about audience analysis is what is audience analysis? And that's all about getting to know your audience, right? What are their beliefs, attitudes, age, education, etc. Once you know something about the audience, then you're going to want to be able to find some common ground with them, right? What do you guys have in common? What can you relate to them about? As you'll notice here in my course, I often speak to you about my experience in college and in graduate school because I know for a fact that all of you are interested in academics. You're here at college to learn something. So that's to start with our common ground. The more you know about your audience, the better you can prepare and reduce your anxiety, right? So it's much more fun to walk into a room where you know the people, maybe some friends or some family, feel much more relaxed. You know that they're going to smile at you. If you walk into a room where you don't know anybody, you know where they're from, you don't even know how to begin your speech. So let's talk about how do we find out some information about our audience. We're going to talk about first direct observation. So this is using our 5 senses, right? That what do they look like, right? Are they female? Are they male? What age group are they in? What's the color of their skin, etc. What do you hear? What do you feel, etc. Ask them about themselves. That's another way to get some information out of your audience. So ask them, right? How many of you are Catholic? How many of you have gone to college before? So there's nothing wrong with just asking them to raise their hands and answer some basic questions. So this is a great way to get some information if you don't know anything beforehand. The last type of direct observation is often we're unacquainted with the audience, and in this case, find someone who is acquainted with them, right? So maybe you're going to speak at your friend's baby shower, right? And she's invited all these friends, all these people that she knows from different parts of her life, but you don't know them. So ask your friend who's going to be there. Are these your friends from work? Are these your friends from school? Are these your friends from childhood? Get to know what do they do? How many family members do they have, etc. So just ask someone else who you might know in the group and ask them about who it is that you'd be speaking to. The next type of audience analysis that we're going to talk about is analysis by inference, right? And so here we talk about when you make a reasoned tentative conclusion on the base of evidence, right? So an example that they give in the book is if we hear someone speaking Arabic, we can infer that they are from the Middle East, right? Makes a lot of sense, right? This is based on patterns from previous experiences, right? We've heard people speaking Arabic before and they were always from the Middle East. So that's our inference. The problem with inferences, right, can sometimes be wrong. My best friend from graduate school, she speaks Arabic, but she's from Washington, D.C. She's not from the Middle East. She happened to marry a guy from Morocco and she lived there for a couple of years, so she picked up the language. But Catherine is not from the Middle East. So you have to be really careful about inferring information about people. Let's move on now to data sampling. If you go into graduate school or study communications, you'll do a lot of data sampling. And it is super interesting because it really helps you get to the core of what the audience is about. Data sampling is statistical evidence to quantify characteristics of the audience, right? How many are females? How many are males? How many are Caucasian, etc. This is also known as quantitative analysis, right? Because once we have that information, we're able to put it into a Google sheet, into an Excel spreadsheet, and manipulate that information. So you can say, okay, in section 1, we had 59% male. In section 2, we had 59% female. And those were at different times of the day. So is there a correlation between when women go to school as opposed to when men go to school? So lots of different ways that you can look at the information. And this information is collected via a survey. All of us have done surveys before, most likely. We're going to look at some examples of these surveys in 2 slides, on slide 9. So now we're going to talk about the basic questionnaire. This is often anonymous, can also include attitudinal data and not just demographic information. Ordered categories. This is also known as valued hierarchy. And then your last type of survey is your Likert type testing. And this is named after a man named Likert. And again, if you go to graduate school, you'll be super familiar with the Likert type testing because it's really the most sophisticated way of creating surveys. And it really helps you get into some detailed information. So Likert type testing is gauging the depth of sentiments towards a statement, either positive, negative, or neutral. And here's that magical slide 9 that I was speaking about from our book. There's some examples of survey questions here. So the demographic questions, right, as I mentioned, right, the academic level in college, are you freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, etc. These attitudinal questions, so you can have them as a multiple choice. But more often, these are given as a value ordered question. So place the list of values in the order of importance from important to most important to least important. And finally, here you have the Likert type questions. So indicate the degree to which you agree or disagree with that question. So as I mentioned, this is the most common type of question that we'll typically see on more sophisticated surveys these days. So all of these different surveys, though, are great and a good way, an excellent way to get information about your audience before you start composing and delivering your speech. The last thing we're going to speak about today is the detailed analysis. There are 5 categories of the audience analysis. First one we're going to speak about in the following slides is the situation analysis. Then we're going to speak about the demographic analysis. We're going to speak about a psychological analysis, a multicultural analysis, and an interest and knowledge analysis. So again, all different ways to look at your audience, all different ways to frame them, to get an idea of what they might be interested in hearing about. So the first 2, we'll start with the first one, the situation analysis, right? The context. Why are we all here together? As I've said, I've already analyzed you all in our situation because we're all here because you have to be, right? Because you're required to take public speaking as a part of the California college curriculum. So I totally get it. Maybe you don't want to be here, but maybe you do. But we're all here together because you have to be. The second type of analysis is the demographic analysis. This is formally done by surveys and interviews and informally as well. And this is also done by sending scouts ahead. This is what we were speaking about before, the surveys, understanding how many male, how many female in the audience, right? How many Caucasians, etc. So finding out the demographics of the group. Now we're going to speak about the psychological analysis. So this is broken down into a handful of different parts. First are the attitudes. Attitudes are learned and not necessarily enduring. So your attitude can change throughout your life. Some examples that the book gives are pro-choice versus pro-life. Right, these are good indicators of how people see the world. What can be changed, as I mentioned. The second type of psychological analysis is getting to understand people's beliefs. Beliefs are principles or assumptions about the universe. People believe in karma, or people believe in ghosts, right? And this was this definition here of being principles. This is cited by Bem in 1970. The last part of the psychological analysis is getting to know your audience by their values. So these are the core principles that drive our attitudes. Point number one here on this slide, right? These are friendship, peace, tradition, right? And so if you look around at your colleagues and your classmates, you'll notice that very quickly, they all have different attitudes, beliefs, values, probably somewhat similar because they're in a class with you and maybe you've had other classes with them before. So you're all continuing on this path together. But the chances of them all having the same attitudes, beliefs, and values is quite unique. So let's go ahead and move on to the last term in this psychological analysis is cognitive dissonance that we want to make people aware of. Cognitive dissonance is when two values come into conflict with another. There's mental stress caused by the choice we are forced to make between two considerable alternatives. And this is a great term because you'll hear this again and again and again, not only in your academic career, but in your life. The example that the book gives in cognitive dissonance is you go to a party and you're having a great time with your friend, but all of a sudden your friend starts to do drugs. And so now you don't know what to do because you're not into doing drugs, you don't agree with it. But now you have two values that are conflicting, right? You want to hang out with your friend, but you don't want to do drugs, right? So what do? Do you continue hanging out with your friend and not do the drugs? Do you continue hanging out with your friend and do the drugs? Or do you leave the party, right? So you have some options, but obviously there's some dissonance in there, right, of conflict. So you want to become familiar with what cognitive dissonance is and how people will have that when they listen and or deliver a speech. The fourth type of analysis is your multicultural analysis. This is first their language, right? What language do they speak? The audience members, what language do they speak? So if they are not native English speakers, which oftentimes we have in these courses, you want to slow down your speech, right? You want to articulate, you want to really pronounce your words. You also don't want to use slang or jargon because they're not going to understand those words. Next one is cognition. This is the ways of looking at logic, right? And so ways of looking at leadership and how things come together. So, for example, as I might have mentioned before, my family is from Switzerland, and when I went to Switzerland a couple of years ago, I had to fill out a form, and it was a typewritten form, but they made a misspelling, so I just took a pen and I crossed out what the misspelling was, and the woman behind the desk flipped out. She was like, no, 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 you can't handwrite anything on this form. It needs to be typewritten again. And so she went out with some whiteout and then retyped the letter again. And so her logic was totally different, right, from mine, in that I did grow up in the United States, and so my logic is a little bit more loose, while in Switzerland they're much more to the rules, to stricter, playing along with what the exact rules are. So that's cognition. One thing we want to avoid here is ethnocentricity, right? When you think your culture is dominant or better than other cultures, right? Obviously, pretty straightforward. I'm not going to review that all that much because I don't think many people do that nowadays, hopefully, right? And then we talk about our values and then our communication style. So values, as we spoke about earlier in this chapter, right? Some people have family as a really high value on their value list, right? Especially the Hispanic cultures, the Jewish cultures, they really place a lot of value on family, as opposed to maybe the American culture is a little bit less, right? We tend to leave the home right away when we turn 18 to go to college or to work, and we move across the country. And so families are not as close-knit traditionally here in the United States as opposed to other places. Also, you want to look at their communication style. So my best example for this one is in Japan, right? When you hand someone a business card in Japan, right? That business card, right, has your name and title and phone number on it. In Japan, there's a really formal way of accepting a business card. So you hand the person the business card with two hands, each corner of the card, and then the person receiving it also has to pick it up, the bottom of the card, with 2 hands. And then the person receiving it looks at it, studies it, and then very carefully files it away in their wallet or their briefcase, whatever it might be. Right? That seems very strange to us, a style that we're not familiar with here in the US very often, right? Someone hands you a business card, typically you take it in one hand, you don't even look at it, you say, nice to meet you, stick it in your back pocket, and maybe you find it later, right? So just be aware of people's communication style. Some people are warm, some people are colder. And so lots of different ways to analyze your audience by looking at these things: language, cognition, ethnocentricity, values, and communication style. Great. The last type of analysis is your interest and knowledge analysis. So figuring out who knows what in the room, right? There will be people who potentially know more or a lot about your subject, and that's okay, but you want to know that beforehand, right? You want to figure out how much do they know, how much more information can I give them? And to the second point here, uniqueness. So being singularly exceptional in interest and knowledge to a given audience. So you want to educate them a little bit, right? You want to tell them something that they don't know. You want to tell them something new, because then that really grabs their attention. So, really understanding what it is that they can grab onto or want to grab onto. 2 semesters ago, I had a student who did his informative speech on the supply and demand curve, right? And so when he was speaking to a group of almost of undergraduates for sure, and not many people who have taken a business course. And so the supply and demand curve is a very basic curve that you study in economics, which I know very well because I have an MBA, but not necessarily do a lot of people in the audience know that. So I thought it was a wise choice because he was really educating people about what that was. But I have to say, he had to really break it down into the elementary steps of what a supply demand curve was, because not many people knew that what that was. So again, you want to gauge your interest and knowledge of your audience. Good, so that completes our chapter 5, audience analysis. Let me know if there are any questions. Thanks so much for coming.